good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are around the world. I'm David, by the way. The other face you can see is Julie. I'm a Professor Emeritus at the University of Hong Kong, although right now I'm broadcasting this from a hotel room in Sydney, Australia, where I'm kind of stuck because I'm having trouble getting a flight back to Hong Kong. And Julie's at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So today what we're going to talk about is developing opportunities for talk in the young EFL learners classroom. And we're going to look at talk in a particular way. We're going to talk about talk as a tool for learning, developing skills for mastering the spoken and written. We're going to use the word genre, and we're going to talk about that later, but the spoken and written genres that learners will need to succeed in the language classroom, or in any kind of classroom, really. Problem solving, developing thinking skills for problem solving, for developing argumentative essays and spoken presentations and so on. So it's a different kind of talk from the very, very basic talk that we presented in the session we did last year for eFuture.
Yeah, so I think often, particularly when we are in EFL context, we may be thinking about macro skills and thinking about speaking, listening, reading, and writing. But I think there are also other ways that we can think about these macro skills. And just as you said, David, I think the things that we are doing when we're learning is we're engaged in doing thinking and communicating work. And of course, we are building our literacy skills in the process. So in this presentation, I think we need to think about what this talk for learning means in relation to learning. And of course, as teachers, we want to know how to plan such talk in our classrooms. So what we'll do here is to outline some concepts we need to understand, and also introduce a model called the teaching and learning cycle that we can help teachers to plan for this kind of talk. I'll use an example that I often use with my learners at the university level. But this task that I will talk about it actually comes from a primary school context. So I think it will be relevant to our audience here. And we'll also show how students' first language can be a resource for developing their skills in English. And in order to do that, we'll need to debunk some myths of L1 usage in L2 learning. And of course, finally, we hope to have some time left in the end to take some questions. So David, let's start with...
Just let me make a couple of points, Julie, before we go to the next slide. The first one is that although the focus is on talk, we're not just talking. We don't just typically talk. We talk, we listen, we read, we write, we make notes. And so we will be looking at the way that talk will be foregrounding talk, but we'll also be showing the connections between these three other macro skills, listening, reading, and writing. And the other point that I'd like to make is that I like to see myself, and I hope you see yourself, as an educator first and a language teacher second, okay? And with globalization and the growing importance of English as a global language, it has to fit into all of the other things that happen in the school day for the children. And we've been doing some research in places such as Korea and Vietnam, where we've been very excited that even quite young children are able to make these connections.
Yeah, great. So let's start with point 3 on the use of the L1 in L2 learning.
This is not a major feature of the presentation, but it's one we're going to be coming back to. Of course, it's a fairly controversial issue in many parts of the world. We're also very aware that in many situations and contexts where you're teaching, it runs contrary to the school or the institution or the organization that you're working for, where there's this policy of English only. And so what we want to start off by doing is to look at some of the traditional objections to, and these are ones that I've experienced many times when I've spoken about the use of L1 in the L2 classroom. As I'm speaking, just think yourselves, what's your position in relation to some of these comments? Do you agree with them or do you disagree? And then also, can you support your position, either for or against, pro or con, with any kind of evidence? So the first one, the top left-hand box, here the argument is that, and this is one I actually subscribed to when I was teaching EFL in Thailand many years ago, that any time you're actually allowing the learners to use their first language in the classroom, it's denying them an opportunity to get maximum exposure in the target language, because very often the only talk that they got from was from me and from some of the tapes and so on. Of course, that was many years ago, and it was way before the internet. But that was one of the arguments, that any time the learners used their first language, then that was denying them an opportunity to, precious time in the classroom to work on their second language. So the second objection is, I'll go down to the one below that, and this relates to the parents. So this is particularly pertinent to those of you who are teaching students in after-school classes and weekend classes, where parents often spend a lot of hard-earned cash on providing opportunities for learners for the young kids to go along to schools of various kinds and to work on their English. And there they say, well, I'm paying all this money, and so I don't want my kids to be speaking their first language, whether it be Korean or Spanish or Chinese or whatever. I want to get the maximum bang for my buck. I want you to be using the target language the whole time. Then if we go back up to the right-hand side, this is another comment that's frequently made. I teach in a situation where there's not a homogeneous first language group. I have learners who speak a range of different first languages in my classroom. I don't speak any of those languages, or if I do, maybe I only speak one of them. And so that I just can't, I don't see how I can make it work. It's not a practical proposition. And then coming back to the final box, that's the one that I touched on in the previous slide, that teachers often say to me, well, my school has an English-only policy, and not only will I get into trouble or even have my wages docked, I may even get fired if the principal of the school hears me using the learners L1, and certainly if I allow my students to use their L1 for learning. Anyway, we've done extensive reviews of the literature, and Julie's going to just touch on some of these research outcomes, and they may be surprising or they may be not.
Thanks, David. So we have known this first point, the one here on the L1, for quite a long time now. But it's in the last 10 years that there's been great agreement in the research and literature on the benefits of the L1 and L2 learning. And a lot of work has been done in multilingual classroom studies to show that second language learners' most valuable resource is indeed their first language. If I just move down here to the activation component, you'll see that in this work by Cummins, since he's been talking about this for a very long time, but that it's not, of course, not just about that students and teachers for that matter, that they have knowledge of multiple languages. That's the focus here, but that there is purposeful use of multilingual strategies that activate students' prior knowledge and experience. And I think a lot of us can understand this, right? We learn about a lot of different things in different languages. So we are not simply speaking another language, but really what we're doing is bringing all of our knowledges when we are learning to speak in another language. So this activation part is quite important. You know, we're using the L1 to activate also our prior knowledge. David, did you want to say something about this?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Julie. First of all, Yeah, so Fred Genesee, who's an eminent scholar, as indeed all of the other people that we're featuring on this slide, yes, he argues that the learner's first language is probably the single most important resource that they can have in learning another language, and he's got quite a lot of research data to support that. And the second, Jim Cummins's statement is kind of similar in that we're not just quarantining it to the second language, but we're also using the learners, and we're going to come back to this later in the presentation, the notion of languages and communication system as resources, and developing the resourceful learner, the learner who, challenging this the kind of deficit notion that learners, we're always telling the learners what they can't do in their second language, but there are lots of things they can do. And in the kind of talk that we want to share with you this afternoon, the kind of classroom, the learning, talking for learning, that by using the L1, you can activate the knowledge that the learners already have in their first language, and you can use that to build on and scaffold the learning of the second language. And we'll give you some examples of that.
Yeah, I'm just conscious of the time, David.
Yes, I know, you're taskmaster.
So the next point here is very complex. It's a very complex area, and that needs a lot of careful consideration of multiple dynamics. But even when we look at standardized tests, scholars in more recent studies are finding that primary students in bilingual programs outperform or are as good as peers in monolingual programs. Again, we can't just go by test scores, but the literature doesn't see students' first language knowledge or usage as a detriment to their learning. In this last point here, we can talk about, for a long time, Professor Francois Grosjean's work has enabled us to understand multilinguals are not two monolinguals in one body. And these days, I think there is a lot of neuro work that is showing this. Is this correct, David?
Yes, indeed. Yes. I should also say that those of you who have seen me speak before, you know I love to tell stories, because stories is what you remember. I know it's stories. When I listen to a talk, it's stories I remember. But Julie read the riot act to me this morning when we were rehearsing this presentation. She said, "Cut all those stories out. We don't have time for them." So anyway, but yes, the work that's been done with resonance imaging and all the rest of it, where the researchers can take snapshots of somebody's brain when they're doing different kinds of tasks, and they found that contrary to the expectations from the past, where there's a bit of the brain here for the first language and a bit of the brain for the second language and a bit here for vocabulary and a bit here for grammar. What they're showing, for example, is that if you get the learners hooked up to an MRI machine and get them reading a story, different vocab words will be activated in different parts of the brain, and it'll be related to what we call semantic networks, other words that have a related meanings in all different complicated areas and complicated ways. I'm going to tell a story, Julie, quickly. My second language that I learned was Italian. Living in Italy, then I went to Thailand, and I was firmly convinced that my second and third languages were located in a different part of the brain from my first, because whenever I had a word in Thai, when I was learning Thai, whenever I had a word in Thai that I didn't know, it wasn't an English word that popped into my brain, it was an Italian word. But maybe my brain is wired weirdly. I never got to be put into one of these fancy machines. Basically, yes, the notion that there's the first language here and the second language there, so there are two monolinguals trapped into one brain. A lot of this neurolinguistic and neurological research is showing that that's actually not right.
Okay, so we've done a very quick summary here, and this all needs careful discussion. But at the end of the day, most studies in the young language learning space agree that the use of, as you see in this more recent study by Kirsch in 2018, the use of all of students' language resources together helps young learners develop their full multilingual repertoires, and it allows them to communicate, to construct knowledge, and ultimately to enact a multilingual identity. And I think, identity development is, of course, inseparable from cognitive development. So we see these understandings as important points that we need to consider. Okay, so David, I think we've now gone in 15 minutes into the talk, so let's move straight into talking about talking to learn.
Yeah. And actually, I've already mentioned this, so I'll just quickly restate what I'm saying. That we're talking about a special kind of talking which is designed to develop the thinking skills on the part of the learners, problem solving, discussing, arguing a point, and all the rest of it. And with the work that we've been doing in Vietnam and in Korea, we found that even quite young children have quite sophisticated skills. I mean, it's embryonic, and we have to keep recycling as they go through the school system, the system from kindergarten through grade 1 to grade 6, and come back and revisit and give them problem-solving tasks and so on. But we've been really excited when you actually trust your learners and you challenge them, but you support them. What surprising things that they can come up with. But that's what it's basically learning to talk and developing these academic language skills that they will need not only in high school and beyond, but also in primary schools as they because they just learn so rapidly. It's just amazing how quickly kids are not capable of not learning. So for young teachers who are a bit worried, oh, I'm pretty incompetent, I say it doesn't matter what you do, your kids are going to learn, so relax.
Okay, so I would really like to acknowledge Professor Beverly Deriwianka, Pauline Jones, and Jennifer Hammond's work here, because they've done a lot of work in this area, and we'll be borrowing from various different publications that they have published on, and you can go and have a look at some of these things too. We'll leave the book recommendations on a little bit later, and maybe that is a good place to start now, looking towards Beverly Deriwianka's book on exploring how texts work.
So there's a term here, genres, common written genres. I'd like to modify that actually and say that they're common genres, that they can exist in spoken form and also in writing. And some of the school genres include recounts, narratives, information, reports, procedures, experimental procedures in a cooking class, procedures for making recipes, arguments, discussions, explanations. And what makes them different from the kind of casual conversation and social conversation that we engage in outside of the classroom is that they involve higher order thinking. And eventually, by the time kids get into upper primary, it's abstract thinking as well. And so a genre has two things that unite it, two things that we want to highlight. One of them is each of these kinds of texts, whether they're spoken or written, will have what's called a generic structure or a framework. Okay, and we're going to give you some examples. So here's an explanation framework. They'll also they'll be characterized by particular vocabulary and grammatical structures. There'll be an overlap, okay, between them, but then some of them will draw more heavily on certain grammatical forms than others. Okay, and so again, in this particular theory of language, this form and function are interrelated. When I started teaching, we'd go and we do a grammar lesson, and then we do a meaning-focused lesson or a communicative task, and we didn't really effectively show learners that you have language in order to enable you to express these different kinds of meanings. And so this is the explanation generic structure, and I won't go through it, you can read it, but you've got the title, you've got then the phenomenon, you've got the explanation sequence and so on. And this one is closely related to the procedural genre as well, although there are key differences. But when Julie gives her extended example of how an umbrella works, she'll be working with the explanation framework. And so here's the argument framework. And again, there are some similarities. So there's a title, there's a statement about the or rhetorical question relating to the argument. And then there's a statement of the issues and so on. And typically what happens is that you can either choose, you might have a statement that all applied linguists call David a genius, right? And you can agree or disagree. So then in an opening paragraph, you teach your learners, well, think of 3 or 4 points that reinforce the side of the argument you want to take. And then in the body of the piece, it could be a talk, right? It could be a poster with a talk, or it could be a fully written piece. So then you'd have a series of paragraphs. You might have your 3 main points. You'd then have a paragraph devoted to each of those, and you'd then round that off by making a pitch to the reader. Well, this is my point of view. Here's my evidence, and this is what I would recommend in that particular.
Okay, so the important thing here really is not so much that we need to go through all of the structures, but that there is a structure involved in these different genres. And also that it's not just the structure. Like sometimes I find that teachers are too wedded to just teaching the structure and not teaching enough of the language features. So each of these genres have a structure, but they also have language features. So for instance, something like, in an argumentative framework, you will use present tense for general, this comes from a science example. So science concepts, or past tense for citing events, or general nouns, and so on. And that doesn't mean that some of those features are not used in an explanation framework. Of course, they are overlap, but there are also.
I think the passive voice. I think the passive voice features in both of these.
Yeah. There are some things that are very prominent in other frameworks, other genres. So it's important to be teaching both the text structure and the language features. Sometimes I also find the opposite, that teachers are teaching too much of the language features and not teaching enough of the big picture. So we need to, the talk is not just about talking, but first of all, of course, we need to have something to talk about, and then students need to have some way of thinking about some structure and some language that they could use in those structures. So there's a lot for us to think about here, right? This is why we are starting to open this up with you, and we'll show you how this kind of all comes together. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind these genres that are quite common for school literacies, because as you will see, this is the case of primary school curriculum in Australia, but young children, even from the foundation years all the way up to year 6, they are doing exactly this kind of work in terms of language and literacy learning. So, from a very young age, they're learning how to write personal recounts, information reports, narratives. You can see as they get older, they do more and more complex things. They have to do a science procedure. They have to do things like information reports or biographical recounts. And then by the time they get to year 6, got information reports and causal explanations. So if we then look at the secondary curriculum, it gets even more and more complex. So it's important that in these primary years that we are able to build strong foundations and give them lots of language that they could continue to expand and extend throughout their school years. So maybe now is the time, David, for us to dive straight into talking about this kind of talk. What is it?
Okay, so the concept we're going to be presenting here is the notion that we tend to think of spoken language as being the stuff that comes out of our mouths, and written language is the stuff that comes out of our fingers as we're typing on our word processor. But in fact, and that's generally the case, but there are certain situations where there are characteristics of spoken language, and we won't go into those in details, and there are characteristics of written language But sometimes when we're writing, if we're writing an email to a friend, for example, or sending a text to a friend, if you look at the language itself, it's much more like spoken language than it is like formal written language. Let me give you a quick example. Think of, imagine a football match between two national teams, a big football match. And during the match, there's going to be lots of language on the field, right? Some of which probably can't be broadcast because it probably uses words that are not polite. But first of all, the language is very tied to the context and situation, right? There's a close physical proximity between the people, the speakers, okay, the football players on both sides of the game, and also the context. And so the language is embedded in the context. So they can use words like this and that and kick the ball over here. Well, here doesn't make any sense in a deep out of context, but in context it makes perfect sense. But there would also be a television, the game would be televised, and then there would be the narrative, the spoken narrative that the presenter is giving. And again, that will be very, because the viewers can see what's going on, he doesn't have to be very explicit. That evening, there's a report on the news, the news, the weather, the sport. In most countries, the news comes first and the sport comes last. In Australia, where they're crazy about sport, often the sport comes first and the political news comes last. But the newsreader actually is reading an account of the game, which is, that account has been written up, right? But it's written to be read. So it displays many more characteristics, quite a few characteristics of spoken language, like a bit of slang, a bit of colloquial language, and so on and so forth. Then the following morning, the local newspaper has a report on the sporting page of the game. And here it's purely written, okay? And it displays all the characteristics of written language. And the writer has to be more explicit because the context, the visual context isn't provided, and also the writer is physically distant from the reader. They're not in close proximity, so they again have to be more precise. So there's this continuum that goes from purely spoken through to purely written, but also in the middle there's writing and speaking. Let's transfer this to a school context then. And this context is where the aim of the class or the series of classes is to develop the ability of the students to understand and produce spoken and written science explanations, an explanation of a science experiment, for instance. And so at the beginning, in the very first lesson, the teachers and the students will be in a science laboratory. There'll be all the equipment, and the teacher will be explaining, but also maybe eliciting from the students what they know, maybe even in their first language. What do they know about these? Do they know what's the Spanish or the Chinese for the word beaker? The thing that holds liquids to be poured. And so that's purely oral. And the ultimate task is for the students to do an oral presentation about the particular science experiment that is being used in this particular instance, and then go on to do a written version as well. And so as they start to move along from the purely oral towards the written, they'll be doing things like maybe searching for information about the particular experiment, doing it in the library or doing it online. And so they might even be listening to explanations, they'll be making notes and so on. Maybe they have to do a presentation, an oral presentation, and have some kind of a visual. It could be on a piece of butcher's paper, white paper, with a diagram and bullet points. So there's listening, there's speaking if they're doing it collaboratively, and then there's also written language. And then when we move to the far end of the continuum, they then collaboratively develop a written version, and there's a lot of speaking there. They're being led by the teacher and supported by the teacher. And then finally, they work independently, either by themselves or with a fellow student, working in pairs or small groups, to produce a written version of the explanation. So again, this integration of the 4 skills at different points, and also the notion of, you know, it's academic talk, literate talk, as Jenny Hammond calls it. Do you want to add anything, Julie?
Yeah, so, you know, ultimately this kind of talk is the kind of talk that students need for deeper thinking and engagement and understanding as they're working with curriculum concepts. So really important here is to make these planned opportunities for the development of spoken language, which then develops into writing. And this is where I think the teaching and learning cycle, you know, can be quite helpful for a lot of teachers. I don't know if this is used widely in EFL contexts. And even if it's not these exact words, it may be something along the lines of this idea. The whole idea of this, and you'll see in just a moment, is that there is a gradual release of responsibility from teachers to students. So with teachers, we may start off very strongly talking with teachers here, and then we do a bit more modeling. Once the students get the model, they are able to then jointly construct. So there's this gradual release that the teacher can take. And then finally, the students can become independent. So I think it would be important or good, David, if we could go through each of these stages.
Sure.
And what we'll do is to link this up with the task, the example that I want to show. So in the first instance, the 4 stages of the cycle are building knowledge of the field, and we'll go through each of these carefully in just a minute. Modeling the genre, and then joint construction of the text, and then independent construction of the text. The example that I'd like to plug this in with is an example on teaching students to write within the explanation genre. And this is not just about writing. Actually, in this particular example, it's about giving an oral presentation. So the genre is an explanation genre, and the task is to get students to write about how an umbrella works. And I think it doesn't matter what place you're in right now, you could do this with your learners. This original example comes from a primary school context. I have used it in many different contexts with many different learners. So I think it is something that all of us can do. And you can find more information on this, and you can just download this for free on the internet. I'm sure all of you will have the slides later, so I'll just leave that for now. The actual task that I've given my students, the instruction is to construct a labeled and caption diagram to accompany an oral presentation explaining how an umbrella works. Okay, so this is work that I've done with my university level students. So obviously they are high level students, but generally what they need to do, and David talked about the text structure just a few minutes ago. So again, in an explanation framework, you will have something like a title, and then you'll have the phenomenon identification. So the students have to write about what is an umbrella, and then they have to write about the explanation sequence, explaining an explanation of how an umbrella works. And with this spoken text, the students often have to have an accompanying poster. So in the actual article, you will see like a model text that a primary student was able to do. And you can have a look at that later. Well, in my own classroom, as I said, my learners are quite high literacy learners, but even then, I find that they are still struggling with the language of how to do this. So typically the students work in groups of 5 to 6, and they begin looking up websites on umbrellas. So I say to them, okay, so what is an umbrella? How does it work? So they all kind of go away and look up websites on umbrellas. And they realize really very quickly that they know what an umbrella is, of course, but they can't describe it because they don't know the actual technical words. They know how to explain something, of course, but they aren't always sure whether their explanations sound formal enough for an oral presentation. So it doesn't matter if you haven't gotten the explicit language instruction, then learners and speakers, I think they realize very quickly that they need the tools, they need the technical language, they need the grammar to be able to do these things in the academic context. So let's talk about how we can use that teaching and learning cycle step by step, and how we can plug in using this task of how an umbrella works to teach students about this, developing this kind of literate talk.
Okay, so the first step is building knowledge of the field. Let me just explain this word field. It doesn't mean like a wheat field or a field of grass. It's really just the subject or the content matter. Okay, so the field, for the example we gave about a science experiment, well, that's what the field is. It's science, and it's the subfield of science experiments. But this is like pre-teaching. The learners, in order for the learners to go on and finally produce an oral or written explanation of umbrellas or experiments or how to make a cake, they need to have certain things. They need to have essential vocabulary. They need to have the relevant vocab. They need to know the steps or the stages in the explanation framework, and so on. And so this is often called scaffolding the learning process. And if you're doing, and this is basically task-based learning, if you're doing task-based learning, you've got to provide them with relevant grammar, vocabulary, and also the right sort of the relevant knowledge. And again, this is where the L1 can come in and can really shortcut the whole process of trying to, I used to go nuts trying to get across in English the definitions of particular terms. And if I was teaching in a school that didn't allow the use of the target language, but in some cases when I did know it, I used to cheat. I'd say, okay, well, it's this and it's that and it's the other. And we won't go through all these activities as such.
Well, that's a great way into what I wanted to show in terms of the things that my students do. So with the umbrella text, the first thing that happens in this building knowledge of the field stage is to open up a lot of discussion. So we talk about what is an umbrella and different kinds of umbrellas, and then initial thoughts on how these umbrellas operate, and then the functions of different umbrellas. So there's like so much talk at this stage. And learners are often looking up a lot of websites to look for vocabulary words because they need those words to be able to talk about these things. And what I really noticed at this stage, and this is why I've highlighted here, is just what you've said, David. It's like they often go and straight to, for instance, Chinese websites because they can read that much more quickly and they can pick out the words much more quickly. They may put those into Google Translate, and then they may put it back in the English into Google and see if that word actually exists in the umbrella world. There's a lot of thinking going on, a lot of reading going on as they're doing this research phase. So there's a lot of opportunity at this stage, as you just pointed out, that for students to use the L1 to discuss and to write the words in English, and they'll all want to extend the vocabulary in both languages. And this is certainly not new. As I said, there's a lot of work that has been happening with the multilingual approaches in schools. And you can see, and you can download these guides for free from the CUNY website. But there's a lot of work that is being done by teachers who have multilingual learners and a diversity of learners in their classrooms. And so if you are unpacking a concept like natural resources and you have Spanish students, Spanish speaking students, the teacher does not do this work. It is the students that go and find those words and populate the graphic organizers. If you have Chinese students there, it can be added also. If some students have lower literacy, they can be using more images. We see math teachers using these, the drawing on students L1. We see science teachers doing this work. So this is certainly not just something that ESL teachers are thinking about and doing, but it is really very clear that across the school, lots of teachers are taking on this idea very proactively, and they're creating something called a multilingual word wall, where they might laminate some of this work, put it up on the walls. It's not just about getting the learners to do that work, but to make multilingualism visible in their schools. So this is some really impressive and exciting work, I think, that schools are starting to show. Okay, let's just move into the modeling stage.
So the next step is providing an example, a model of the genre. Okay, when it says deconstructing the genre, it just means to deconstruct means to just pull apart, and we'll show you an example. Well, Julie will show you an example in a minute of how you give them a piece of text. Again, there's a lot of oral work going on here. You give them a text, and then you focus on, first of all, you focus on form and function. I mentioned the passive voice. Okay. A while ago. So if that's an important feature in certain types of genres. But in the traditional way of teaching passive voice, it was just like giving people a active voice statement. You know, the boy broke the window was broken by the boy, which doesn't really teach the learners the function. It seems that there are two different ways of saying the same thing in English, just to make it difficult for you, the second language learner. But the focus is very much on bringing together the form and the function, and showing the grammatical forms in actual use.
So with my umbrella text, we open up discussions here to start talking about language more explicitly. So I bring in a model text of what the poster is supposed to look like, and I focus on understanding the structure of the text and the language features related to an explanation genre. So this particular one, you don't have to look at this very carefully, but in this particular one, this is not the one on umbrellas, but this is an explanation text model. So maybe I will use some visual to help the students understand the sequence of an explanation text and a little explanation about that. And then I will give them a little model text. We see here on the left-hand side, we will do this annotating together. So not a good idea to just give students a worksheet and say, hey, I've deconstructed the worksheet. Now look at the worksheet. Do you understand the worksheet? Now plug in whatever you need to plug in. This is happening a lot. And I think part of it is because there's just no time for teachers to go through these things. But it is crucial that the modeling has to be done together with the teachers and the learners. So, we might start out with one paragraph from the beginning, and we'll say, okay, so what, in terms of the structure, is this the title? Is this the introduction? What is this, right? So we might deconstruct that together, and students might say, okay, this is about the identification of the phenomenon. And then on the other side, we might do some annotations looking at the language features. Okay, so what do you see here? We see a lot of technical terms. We see some passive voice. Okay, so maybe we need to pause, and we need to do some active and passive voice activities and some practice. So this is the way in which language is taught with the content, and it's taught together. It's not taught in isolation, and it's taught with the meaning, right? Because it's the learners understand why, when we use passive, in what paragraph, what kind of structure, which kinds of genres, and so on. So it's very important here in the modeling stage that this doesn't just become about worksheets and giving it out and then students are doing it on their own. This must be done jointly. Okay, so if we move into the joint construction.
Okay, so with joint construction, it's the teacher working with the learners to create a written text that exhibits all the features of the particular genre. And what's important, you can see that the word process is highlighted there in the slide. There are writing results. There are two aspects to writing. One is the process, okay, the process of creating a text, and then the product at the end of it is the text. In very traditional ways of teaching writing, the process was tended to be overlooked. The learners would be given a model, and then they would say, then they would be asked to basically just reproduce that model. Well, this is quite a different process. They've had the process and the internal workings of an explanation genre spelled out for them and the kinds of features, and so then they would work, and the teacher would work collaboratively. He wouldn't just give a lecture, or she wouldn't just give a lecture, but would also do a lot of elicitation, shaping of responses, getting students to suggest a particular way of starting off one of the stages of the genre, moving the stuff around. If you've got an interactive whiteboard, or if you're doing it, I tend to do this kind of stuff on a word processor, which is linked to a screen. And so the students can, as they make suggestions, and I shape it and build out the text for them, and then I'll move stuff around. I'll ask them if they think that sentence 2 fits in better with should be sentence 3 and all the rest of it. And so we move the text around. And so that's the process of writing, the process of coming to a product that's an effective one in terms of fulfilling the purposes of that particular genre.
So in this particular example of the umbrella text with my high literacy learners, obviously I don't need to do that much handholding, but in secondary or even primary, I would do this joint construction with the teacher and modeling the process of writing together. Yes, that's definitely necessary. In my case, I often have those kinds of language features and things like that up on the board. And then I might give students some guided worksheets where they could go off and do the work on their own. So what I often find in terms of the joint construction stage for my learners is that they immediately get into their groups and they start to negotiate the design of the poster and the different roles that they're going to take. So sometimes the students go and say, I'll be the website searcher, you be the translator, you be the drawer, the writer, the presenter. And what I really like about this process is that the students really draw on each of their own strengths, which I think, it doesn't have to be dictated by teachers. The students can, of course, they have agency to do that on their own and make those decisions. Using their guided worksheets in groups, the students might be making initial comments, and they often do this verbally. So they're doing a lot of talking at this stage too. And in the form of notes, then we're starting to make notes in any language that gets the job done quickly. It's interesting though, because the way that we have been socialized is not to use the L1. So when I walk around the room, all my students, they stop speaking in Chinese or Spanish or whatever. And each time I have to remind them that if that's helping you to learn, that's purposeful. That's a really good thing. You should continue to do it. Anyway, so they're doing a lot of work like that on observing, sequencing their explanations, clarifying suggestions. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of talk involved in this stage too. But I do think that this is the stage where they start to move along the continuum, and they do you're gradually releasing the responsibility to them.
The final stage is the independent writing stage, and this can either be done with each student writing their own individual text, or I much prefer having them working in pairs or even in small groups, because again, they have to then articulate that. So they're using the language, they're using the spoken language as they wrestle with concepts and ideas that might starting to become quite complex. And they work together to create the text. And very often I'll get them then, once they've got a draft text together, to work with another pair. So then there's a group of 4, and they exchange their texts, and they go through it, and they work with one text, and then the next one they look at things such as, are there any spelling errors? Are there better ways of putting are there any stages in the framework that are missing? That's quite typical in the early stages of the learning process. They'll get some of the steps right, but often there'll be a missing step. And learners working together, very often they learn more from their fellow students who are more competent than they will from the teacher, because the fellow students who might be just one stage better than them can provide them with insights and so on. The notion, this comes from Vygotsky, who argues that this process allows a learner to grow, to outperform their competence if they're working with someone who has got greater levels of competence, either in content knowledge or in terms of their linguistic levels of proficiency.
Okay, so in going back to the last stage of my own umbrella text example, the students at this stage look very carefully for the formal language. So they have done a lot of work together. They put the text together, and they do it in lots of different languages. But it's at this end stage that they start to look very carefully for the formal language. And I have to tell you, even at the master's level, we're in teacher education programs, there are many learners who are not that conscious of the academic language, but through explicit instruction, they do become much more attuned to refining their language. So even if you looked at this little example here, this particular poster was first written all in Chinese, and then the students wanted to then move that into English. And then once they did they just did it, and then they looked at it a bit more carefully, and they started to cross out things like step 1, step 2, step 3, because they knew that the language that they have to use, the language features they have to use, are those timed connectives, things like firstly, to begin with, then, next, or finally. So they're becoming more conscious of it, and they're starting to go, okay, yes, this is a draft, I need to make another draft. So you can see that this process is a very, very gradual process, and it's not something that you just immediately go in and teach them, this is an essay format. Now let's just do it, and just do it like 3 times. No, there are different stages of this process. And the students at this stage also do a lot of oral rehearsals within their groups, and they use the umbrella without the text. They don't look at the text anymore, and then they check whether or not their instructions make sense to other people. So there's a lot of listening kind of work being done here too. So I think it's really important that the students, at this stage, they are able to, of course, reflect on their work and all that, but also to bring back the ideas of the first language and making them more conscious of why the usage of the first language is useful and purposeful for them in these learning contexts. So I do try to build in some reflective time, thinking about the purposeful use of languages. And these are some of the answers that the students themselves say, because I say to them, what opportunities did you have to use your L1? And the students will say, to kick off conversations, to look up words, to negotiate roles and designs, to jot down notes, to get ideas and thoughts down, to create translations. As you can see, all of these things are on task. They are not talking about what they're going to have for dinner or what Korean drama they watch. They are not talking about those things. They are talking about the task, and everything that they know and can do in any language is brought to getting this task done.
Really, often when I do this, their response is, "Oh, we never used our first language at all." And I've been going around, and it's, they've been using it like crazy, and I got
Exactly.
and then they come up,
yeah,
they
yeah.
reflect.
I also tend to ask them why was it helpful when you can do everything in English anyway? And it's really interesting because this gets even deeper, right? It's not just about the task. The students were saying I felt more comfortable and easier to understand. So then they feel more connected and motivated to the topic. They understand the meanings better. They can focus more on the meaning because it's really about meaning, isn't it? At the end of the day, and they're not so scared to be judged on the accuracy or the correctness, which is something that often stops our students from speaking. And then being able to do this work in our home and target language in both languages helps us to see that we can create multiple texts in multiple languages. And I really think that's all about a sense of expertise, that what we talked about before, this development of the multilingual identity, and that they have some confidence to speak. You want to have confidence to speak? This has to be planned very carefully. It's not just going to happen by giving them a few tricks to do some speaking skills. So I think you can see that the teaching and learning cycle and understanding something about literate talk, and that you need to have knowledge of genre, you need to have knowledge of the language structures, the language features. All of these things actually come together to help students achieve what they need to achieve. Outside of these, these are just some student group work samples, and I have hundreds of these. And students have been nice enough to allow me to present them. But it's not just the matter of the fact that they can, of course, get the text done. But at the end of the day, it also means that there's a lot of creativity involved. Every single one of these groups have done these things differently, and they bring their ideas together and collaborate. And I think you can just tell yourself, just by looking at them, the students have great fun doing it, making little polka dots or, different colors and little cartoon strips. They just have a great time doing it. And I don't think there's any harm in having fun as you are doing some really serious academic work of learning. So let's sum this up, David.
All right, so then in summary, and I'm very conscious that we're almost out of time, first of all, we wanted to emphasize this notion of literate talk or academic talk. It's talk directed towards when they're doing tasks and projects that require abstract thinking, problem solving, and so on, the different functions of academic talk. But then we also made the point that there's an interaction that speaking and writing are not in two separate boxes. They exist on a continuum, and there's a lot of work that's done between purely speaking and purely writing, where the learners are involved in doing both, making notes, summarizing, making a poster and then speaking to it, and so on and so forth. And if we relate that to the teaching learning cycle, we can see that as the learners move through these 4 stages, that they begin by focusing pretty much on speaking and listening, and then they move on to stage 2, where it's speaking and reading, when they're modeling, when they're looking at, they're discussing, they're reading a sample text and they're discussing and deconstructing it and so on. And then in the joint construction stage, they're involved in speaking, reading and writing. And then in the independent construction, there's, particularly if they're working collaboratively, and we would strongly urge that particular approach, they're both speaking and constructing and writing as they're producing the target text.
So what's important here, I guess, that we need to get across is that we need to scaffold the talk to build confidence in speaking in English, And I think, you can
And to
see that.
provide some of the linguistic and knowledge tools and.
That's right. Yeah. And that teachers and learners both have different roles that they need to take up in each of these stages. So just some concluding remarks to bring it all back together. We believe, we like Cummins' idea here that effective pedagogy constructs an image of the student as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented. Individual differences in these traits do not diminish the potential of each student to shine in specific ways. So teacher-student interactions, inherently, you have to have, they are made up of maximum cognitive engagement, but also maximum identity investment. So it's important for us here to not work from deficit, okay, that we want to move away from that, and we want to move into the space of the funds of knowledge, drawing on everything students bring, and not just drawing on them, but drawing on them resourcefully, purposefully, for purposes of learning. And this is how we will now see in the multilingual approach kind of dynamic bilingualism, where we're bringing everything that we can to enable our learners to learn. We'll leave you here with some book recommendations. This is more of a book that I think makes sense in the Australian context because it was written for the Australian curriculum. But if you're a secondary school teacher, for instance, or probably even primary, working with other subject contents like, science, geography, history, and so on, you may want to look at a book like that helps you to think with the teaching and learning cycle and the language features, the text structures, and then and making the links to that and the subject matter. This is a very good book for primary school teachers, I think. It has a lot of examples that you can be using with primary school students, and it uses the teaching and learning cycle and really breaks down for you lots of examples of how to do this kind of work in schools. The other is our key focus, in this talk is about that idea of talking to learn. So if you want to know more about that, this edited collection by Pauline Jones and Jennifer Hammond is very good. So I think we might just leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, Julie, that I've been in Sydney all week and it's been the wettest week in Sydney in 100 years and I've ruined 3 umbrellas. So I don't know if I could write a text about how an umbrella works, but I could sure do a good job of writing one about how an umbrella doesn't work. Anyway, good. Thank you all.
You make the sample text, then let me know. Okay, we might just stop sharing that.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Julie Choi and Dr. David Nunan for the presentation today. Just have a few things. So I saw a lot of questions in the chat regarding the presentation and if we were going to be able to review today's webinar. We will be uploading this webinar to our YouTube channel. So that will be uploaded within the next few days. The presentation slides we will be making available to you guys, so don't worry too much about that. So if you want more information about eFuture, we have all of our SNS and social media platforms. If you want more updates on our webinars and everything, we will be continuing webinars every month from here. So we do have all the webinars previously that we've had are uploaded on our YouTube. So if you're looking for any other subject topics, you can look through the videos that we have updated already on our YouTube channel. We do have, like I said, webinars coming up next month as well. So we have one by Paul Nation, okay, continuing our expert series webinars on vocabulary. And I will be doing a webinar for kindergarten classrooms next month. So if you follow us on social media, you can find those registration links very soon. And for the certificates of attendance today, be sure to email and message these wonderful distributors that we have, and they will be able to get you your certificates of attendance today. And last thing here is, of course, we'd love to get your guys' feedback about our webinars, what we can do better, what kind of subjects that you guys want to hear about going forward. So my colleague has put the survey link in the chat. So please fill that out for us, and we will, continue to try to improve and help you guys out the best that we can moving forward. So I'll go ahead and leave up this chart here for you guys in all the different countries that have attended today. So be sure to get your certificates, and we will see you guys at the next webinar next month. Okay, so thank you again one more time to Dr. David Nunan and Dr. Julie Choi, and we will see you all and hope you all are safe. Okay, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.